Hello and welcome to Lecture 6 on the Baroque era. Today we're going to wrap up our examination of the different instrumental genres of the Baroque era by talking about the fugue. So just to recall, we started out looking at these different genres of music with opera. And I started with opera because the invention of opera right around 1600 is really more than anything what defines the beginning of the Baroque era. And also, opera is the most important genre of the time. It's the most influential on other genres, so that really is the place to start. Having started with opera, we looked at different genres of instrumental music, like the sonata, the concerto, the suite, and today we're going to look at the fugue. And then after we've dealt with the fugue, we're going to go back and talk about our remaining vocal plus instruments genres of music, the cantata and oratorio. Now, having said that, I should say right off the bat that a fugue is not necessarily an instrumental genre. It just, in practice, it turns out to be that most fugues are written for instruments, but they could be sung by voices, and there are examples of fugues or sections within a piece of music which are fugal in structure that are sung by a choir, but in practice, most fugues are for either a solo instrument that is capable of playing more than one note at a time, like a keyboard. That's the most common. It's not the only possible, but it's the most common instrument that might be used, either an organ or a harpsichord or a piano. So it has to be an instrument that is capable of more than one note at a time, or it could be an ensemble of instruments, either a small group or a large group, right? And this is because a fugue is always a polyphonic composition. That's sort of the number one thing that defines it. Remember, polyphonic means having several layers of melody going on at the same time, and each layer of melody is considered more or less equal and independent. I'm just going to take a second, though, and remind you that as you are looking at these different genres, as you're reading about them, as you're listening to examples of them in your listening, please keep the name of the genre in your mind. In other words, do not refer to these pieces as songs, even in your own head. Don't think, okay, I'm going to listen to this song. I'm going to listen to this song. They are not songs. A song is a specific thing, and it's a genre, but not all music are songs, right? So the first thing to know about these different genres is the correct terminology for them. So as you are listening to, for example, the first movement of Vivaldi's concerto for violin and orchestra, think, okay, I'm listening to a concerto. I'm listening to the first movement of a concerto, or I'm listening to the first movement of a suite, or whatever it is. Use the correct titles, even just in your own mind. Do not think of everything as songs. It might be a kind of a hard habit to get out of, but please do that. I think it'll make it easier for you when you go to, for example, identify some of these pieces in the listening. Okay. I should also say that regarding the fugue is a complex, challenging, difficult type of piece. It's both challenging and complex and difficult to compose and also to talk about, to teach about, right? There are a lot of terms in here, and some of these terms that you see in bold print or italics in the book, some of them apply not just to fugues, but some of these features can be found in other types of music. Some of them are more or less particular to fugues. Some of them are features that we find in all fugues, and some of them are features that we might find as sort of optional, that don't necessarily have to be found in a fugue, but could be. Right? And there's a lot of them, so I urge you to try and keep track of them. They are the kind of things that I would expect you to know on a test. If you have any questions about them, please feel free to email me and ask away. I'll do the best I can to explain them here. But if that explanation isn't clear, please reach out to me. So I said a fugue is a complex, challenging, difficult type of piece to compose. I would say that if you ask the average composer what type of piece represents the greatest challenge for you, I think they would probably answer the fugue. And it's always been, or maybe not always, but it's long been considered the sort of ultimate test for a composer to write a good fugue, a fugue that fulfills sort of the technical requirements of a fugue, but also sounds good, sounds natural, not forced. Here's how the book describes it. One cornerstone of Baroque music, and I'm here on page 112, is the fugue, which can be written for a group of instruments or voices, or for a single instrument, such as an organ or a harpsichord. A fugue is a polyphonic composition based on one main theme called a subject. So this is something that all fugues have, and all fugues start out with just the subject, the main melody, right? And this subject is presented in one layer of the polyphonic texture. It's presented initially in what we might call one voice. Now, I just said that usually fugues are for instruments. They are usually for instruments. They could be for voices, but either way, they are conceived of vocally as if you had a choir or an ensemble of, let's say, 3 or 4 singers, each with their own independent line. So let's say in a 4-voice fugue, we would have a soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. They're not necessarily really a soprano, alto, tenor, bass. They are melodic lines for whatever instrument, whatever combination of instruments or singers, which occupy that range, right? So just because we might point to this line in a fugue and say, okay, this is the soprano line, it doesn't mean there's necessarily a soprano, a young lady with a high voice singing it. It means that's the voice that has the uppermost range, and then there will be others. Since a fugue is polyphonic, it must have a minimum of 2 voices, right? We call them voices. Again, I'm going to use that term over and over again, even if in reality it's being played on an instrument. So we need a minimum of 2 voices because by definition, polyphonic texture means multiple layers of melody going on simultaneously. You could have as many voices as you want, but sooner or later, it would just get too crowded. Okay, if you had, let's say, I don't know, a 10-voice fugue, well, each one of those voices, in order to keep from kind of knocking into each other or crossing paths with each other, there's only so much range. There's only so much bandwidth probably that your ear can take in. So in practice, most fugues are for 3 or 4 voices. Occasionally you might find a 2-voice fugue. Occasionally you might find a 5-voice fugue. But I would say 95% of all fugues are either 3-voice fugues or 4-voice fugues. Right. There's also, by the way, since as I said, probably the majority of fugues have been written for keyboard instruments, right? This also limits the number of voices you can have. Even on an organ where you have a pedal board being played with your feet, it's conceivable that you could have, let's say, 2 or even 3 different voices going on with your fingers, right? And those voices, it's not that necessarily one hand has one voice. You could have a voice which has to be distributed between the 2 hands sometimes. So let's say, if I'm looking at a Bach fugue for organ and it's a 4-voice fugue, then the uppermost voice might be generally played with the upper fingers of my right hand. The middle voice is going to be sometimes with my right hand, sometimes with my left hand, sometimes even with, let's say, the lower fingers of my right hand, the upper fingers of my left hand. And like the tenor voice might be played mostly by the lower fingers of my left hand, and the bass voice would be played by my feet on the pedal board, right? And for this reason, for keyboard players, especially, for example, if we're playing on the piano where we don't have a pedal board, we have to spend quite a bit of time working out exactly which notes are going to be played by which fingers in order to maintain this polyphonic texture. Okay, but in any case, no matter how many voices we have, usually between 2 and 5, 3 and 4 voice fugues are the most common. The first thing we will hear is the subject, the main melody, presented in one of those voices. And that subject will be presented, and then as soon as it is completed, another voice will enter with the subject, either lower or higher, depending on which voice I start out with. So if I start out with the soprano voice, which is pretty common, if I start with the soprano voice presenting the subject, after that subject has been completed, another voice will take up that subject. And they might play, it might play the exact same notes, or the exact same notes an octave down, or maybe the same basic melody, but only a fifth down, or a fourth down, some regular interval away, transposed, right? While that second voice is presenting the subject, the initial voice, which presented it first, will carry on, right? It will carry on with some kind of contrasting material, something which will go well in conjunction with the subject, as it is now being sort of handed off like a baton in a relay race. The subject is handed off to the second voice, but the first runner, if you will, keeps going, presenting some kind of contrasting material, right? This pattern continues until all of the voices, however many voices that the composer has decided to have, until all of those voices, and again, voices in quotes, right? Not necessarily real people singing, but vocal parts. The fugue is conceived of in these different vocal ranges. So it's sort of like a relay race, and however many runners, however many voices we have, the subject of the fugue is heard in turn in each one of these voices, and as one finishes its presentation of the subject, another voice will pick it up, and we call these entrances of the subject. The book also says it could be called an answer. In other words, the subject is presented in one voice and then answered in another voice. It makes an appearance in another voice. But again, as it makes its appearance, the voice which had started things off continues on with some different material, something that is not the subject. And this pattern continues for as many voices as you have. And this is what happens in the opening section of a fugue. The subject is presented in successive voices, either from highest to lowest, or lowest to highest, or from the middle out, something like that. Doesn't really matter, right? Which way the composer decides to do it, which order they decide to do it regarding the different voice ranges. Okay, this opening section of a fugue, wherein the subject is presented in a succession of different voice ranges, sort of like a relay race, but with the runners continuing to run after they've handed off the baton, which is the subject. This opening section is called the exposition of a fugue. And this is always the way it's done in a fugue. We have an exposition where the subject is presented in one voice at a time for as many different levels, or as many different voices as the composer has decided to have in that fugue. So the exposition is the opening section of a fugue. Now, there's a lot more that goes on. That's just the opening section. But even within that opening section, the composer has a couple of options. So one thing that he might try to do is, let's say he presents the subject initially in one voice, and then the next voice takes up the subject and presents it. This voice here that started things off is going to, as I said, present some different material, some contrasting melodic material that must be made in such a way that it sounds good in conjunction with the subject itself when it is appearing in the next voice. That new thing, that new melodic line, could either be something that is just used that one time and not necessarily used again, or it could be something that now is going to occur consistently whenever the subject appears from now on. It could be a counter subject. A counter subject is a sort of a secondary theme which will appear consistently whenever the subject appears. Right? And this adds an extra layer of difficulty, because once a composer decides to do this, it says, okay, not only am I going to have a subject, I'm going to have a counter subject, right? Then every time the subject appears, if you're like following the rules of a fugue, then that counter subject has to appear. It has to appear consistently. It's like a little extra challenge that the composer sets for himself, to have a counter subject. Now, let's say we have a subject and a counter subject. What happens when, let's say, a third voice comes in? Well, then this voice is probably going to take up the counter subject, and the voice that started things off is going to have some, yet again, different material, which has to sound good in conjunction with the subject and the counter subject now, right? This is the challenge of polyphonic texture, because you have to think both horizontally. You have to create melodic lines that sound good in and of themselves, but then they also have to sound good when juxtaposed against a different melody, and maybe a yet again different melody, depending on how many layers, how many voices we have going on in the fugue. So a true counter subject is actually not usually found. Now, I haven't looked at every fugue ever composed by anybody, but I would say probably less than half the time do we have a true counter subject that appears consistently. In fact, even within the book, the fugue that is used as an example, it's a fugue by J.S. Bach, the one that they present as a listening example, they label something as a counter subject. This isn't really, I would say this does not meet the strict definition of a counter subject, because it doesn't appear consistently in this particular fugue every time the subject appears. Now, I'm not going to write Mr. Kamian and get into a dispute with him, but I would argue that it's not really a counter subject. I think it appears maybe more than once, but it doesn't appear every single time, right? So that might be something that music professors quibble about. But either way, a counter subject, when consistently used, is something that could appear in a fugue, but it adds an extra layer of difficulty. Now, what happens after that initial exposition of a fugue? Well, usually what happens is we have some kind of contrasting episode where the subject is not present. Because think about it, if we've got, let's say, a 4-voice fugue, we've just heard the subject 4 times, right, appearing in each of the different 4 voices. And what we need now, according to the principles of form, right, where we like to have some continuity, but we also like to have some variety, what we need now is something different. So the composer will usually have something called an episode. An episode is simply a contrasting section within a fugue in which we hear some musical material that is not the subject. Right? Pretty simple, right? It could be anything, but it's something that is, composer's basically giving us a break from the subject and also preparing us for the next appearance of the subject. So after that episode passes and we've had our fill of contrasting material, the subject will appear again. And whichever voice it appears in, if the composer has decided to incorporate a counter subject in this fugue, then the counter subject also must appear again in conjunction with the subject, right? And basically, throughout the rest of the fugue, however long or however short it is, we are going to have sections of the fugue where the subject is present in one or more voice, right? And maybe the counter subject, if there is one, and we'll be hearing that subject in the texture along with other things, maybe above and below it. And then we will have contrasting episodes where the subject is not present. So You can analyze a fugue, and you'll say, okay, here I see an appearance of the subject in the bass or in the alto. And here, for a few measures, the subject is not present. That's an episode. And here the subject returns. Right? So this is why we might say, this is why some scholars do say, that fugue is not really a form, because there is no one sort of preset mold as to when you have these episodes, how many times the subject's going to appear, right? It's more of a procedure or a genre. It's not really, strictly speaking, a form, one might say. And this will go on for however long the fugue is. Some fugues are fairly short, maybe only a couple minutes long. A fugue could be longer. It could be 15 minutes long. I don't think they don't usually go too much longer than that. But they could range from anything between, let's say, 2 or 3 minutes to 10 or 15 minutes. And throughout that time, you will have places where you will have entrances of the subject in different voices, and you will have these contrasting episodes. So these are things that are found in all fugues: a subject, an exposition, contrasting episodes. All right. Now we'll get to some of the things that are optional that we find in some fugues and not others. So one of them I already talked about, counter subject. Composer doesn't necessarily have to have a strict counter subject. They will have some contrasting material that will appear in conjunction with the subject, but it doesn't, strictly speaking, have to be a counter subject. Some of the other things the book mentions, these are techniques that we might find in a fugue. One is stretto, in which the subject is imitated before it is completed. What do they mean by that? It is imitated before it is completed. Well, let's say that our subject is 4 measures long. Okay. In the exposition of our fugue, we will hear the complete subject, 4 measures, and after those 4 measures, the next voice, the next runner in the relay will take it up, and 4 measures, and then the next one, 4 measures. However, the composer might decide at some point within the fugue to have the subject appear, and then before it is able to be completed, let's say maybe only 2 measures through, another voice presents the subject, so that we're hearing, let's say, the latter half of the subject in one voice being juxtaposed on the first half of the subject in another voice. It's sort of like an overlapping appearances of the subject, instead of like this. And again, this is a challenge, because you have to come up with a subject in the first place where it sounds good juxtaposed against itself, right? And that's not always going to be the case. You might come up with a subject that sounds good, but then when you try and juxtapose it against itself this way, with it overlapping, you might have some weird clashes in there. It might just not sound good. Right? So this, again, adds another level of difficulty. It's something that the composer has to think about really before they've even started composing the fugue. Even in the act of coming up with the subject, they have to do some pre-planning and say, okay, if I'm going to do a stretto, I have to make sure that this particular subject, which I've just come up with, is going to sound good when juxtaposed against itself in an overlapping way. By the way, that word stretto in Italian literally means stress. So we are stressing the subject by presenting it in this kind of overlapping way. Another common procedure is pedal point or organ point, in which a single tone, usually in the bass, is held while the other voices produce a series of changing harmonies against it. Pedal point is something that we often find in fugues, but it's something that is not necessarily only found in a fugue. Any piece of music could have, within the texture, whatever texture we have, you could find a place where there's one note that is simply held for a long time. And as that one note is held, as other notes move around above and below it, or let's say above it or below it, in such a way that we have changing intervals between the other material and the one constant note of the pedal point, It creates interesting dissonances and consonances, different harmonies, right? It's called a pedal point because it's easiest to do this kind of thing on an organ, where you can just smash down on one pedal and have that note sustain while you're playing moving notes with your fingers. Notice that this is the kind of thing that really only works well if you have an instrument which can sustain a tone for a long time. Doesn't work very well on the piano, certainly not the harpsichord, because on the piano and the harpsichord, as soon as you play a note, it starts getting softer and dying away. And on a harpsichord, it dies away pretty quickly. Right? On the piano, it'll die away more slowly, but it depends. Lower notes will sustain for a longer time. Higher notes will sustain not very long. And this is why a pedal point is usually something that's done in a lower register. On the organ, you have a steady supply of wind, and so whether it's a high note or a low note, you can sustain it indefinitely as long as you keep your finger or your foot down on that one note. So this is something that we find fairly often in fugues. This is not something that is technically difficult to do, obviously. You're just holding one note and having melodic material moving in the other voices and just kind of enjoying the resulting harmonies which ensue. Here are some other things, optional things that might happen in a fugue, and these are different ways of reconfiguring the subject itself. All right. Things that we can do to the subject of a fugue within a fugue. One of them is inversion. Inversion is simply when we take the different intervals of a fugue, like let's say it goes up a third and up another third and then down a fourth and then up a step, whatever it is, right, the melodic profile, and we turn it upside down. So instead of going up a third, down a fourth, up a step, maybe it goes down a third, up a fourth, down a step, right? Just flipping the intervals and reversing them. For every interval going up, we instead go down, right? Inversion. Anything that is inverted is turned upside down, right? Here's another one. Retrograde. Retrograde simply means backwards, right? So if our subject is something like, C, D, F, D, C, whatever I just said, think it backwards. C, D, F, E, D, C, whatever. You just take the notes and you play them backwards. Now that's different from inverting. Inverting is when you're playing the intervals in the same direction, but you're just going down instead of up and up instead of down. Retrograde is when we have a melody and we play it backwards, right? Switch it this way. Another thing that we could do is we could take we could manipulate the time values of the notes. We could either double all the time values, all the durations, and that's called augmentation. So for example, if the rhythm of my subject was like quarter note, half note, eighth note, if we double all those, then we would have half note, whole note, quarter note, right? So we've got a version of the subject which is exactly twice as long in time as the original. We can do the opposite. We can have diminution. So again, if my subject originally was like quarter note, half note, eighth note, the diminuted version would be eighth note, quarter note, 16th note. Right? Each of these different things, some of them we could do simultaneously. We could have a retrograde inverted version of the subject where not only is it backwards, but all of the intervals are flipped. We could have either one of those things, retrograde or inversion, in combination with augmentation or in combination with diminution. Now, we can't really do augmentation and diminution at the same time because they would cancel each other out, right? Because if I double all the note values and then I cut them all in half, I wind up exactly with the same note values, the time values that I already started out with. But each of the others can be combined. And not only that, usually when a composer does this in a fugue, like let's say they're composing a fugue and they say, you know what I'd like to do right here is I would like to have an augmented version of the subject. Usually when they do that, so let's say we've got an augmented version of the subject, all the time values are doubled so that the subject is stretched out to twice its original length. Usually when they do this, they also present in another voice the original version of the subject. So now, if you're going to do this, you have to make sure that your original version of the subject sounds good when juxtaposed against an augmented version of itself. All right, now this is true for all these other techniques as well. A composer might say, I want a diminuted version of the subject. Usually they also present at some point the original subject in conjunction with the diminuted version, or in conjunction with the retrograde version or the augmented version. These techniques, for that reason, they pose a tremendous challenge. To do something like that and have it sound natural and not forced and not just downright bad is a challenge for a composer, and you don't see these things all that often. A fugue is challenging enough just on its own to write well without these techniques, but these are some things that you may find in a fugue. And these are also things that you can find in other types of music besides fugues. In other words, the concept of retrograde or inversion and augmentation and diminution, these are things that can be done to any melody, not just a fugue. It's just that we tend to associate them more with fugues in practice. If we see an example of augmentation or diminution of a melody, it's usually within the context of a fugue, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. You could take any melody and do any one of these things to it. It doesn't necessarily have to be the subject of a fugue. What else do we see? It says here, fugues usually convey a single mood and sense of continuous flow. Okay, well, this is something that's true of Baroque music generally, remember. One of the characteristics, going back to our lecture on basic characteristics of Baroque music, is that a Baroque piece usually expresses one basic mood. The composer chooses one particular mood that he wants you to feel as you're listening to the piece and sticks with that mood. All right. And the way that this is done is in part by like rhythmic continuity. Right? Now, if the composer wants contrasting moods, remember, what we will usually do is we will have a multi-movement piece. So we'll have a first movement which has a particular mood, a particular tempo, let's say, and then we'll have a second movement which has a different mood, maybe a different tempo. Remember I talked about the concerto last time. Concerto is a 3-movement piece. Fast movement, slow movement, fast movement. We have different moods presented within these different movements, but within a given movement, we usually have one more or less consistent mood. This kind of thing is often done with fugues. Often what a composer will do is they will juxtapose the fugue with another piece that usually comes before it. And the two most common are prelude and fugue and toccata and fugue. All right. Prelude is a term that I introduced last time because I said, remember, the suite, which is another multi-movement piece, instrumental piece, where we have different movements. Each movement has a different mood, a different tempo, a different rhythm, whatever. And in the case of a suite, they are imitative of dance genres, popular dance genres that people knew and could relate to in those days. Well, sometimes at the beginning of a suite, there is a prelude, right? Which is like just as the title implies, it's just a piece that comes before something else, right? So we might have a prelude, and then we have the dance-like movements of a suite. Same thing in a fugue. We might have a prelude and then a fugue as a 2-movement piece. And the idea is there's contrast. There's not only contrast of mood or maybe tempo from one to the other, right? Because the prelude and the fugue are 2 different pieces. They have their own beginning and end, but they're meant to be played one after the other as a 2-movement work. They also have a deliberate sort of contrast of purpose in a way. As you can tell from, it's taken me half an hour just to describe the various techniques of a fugue. it's a piece that involves a lot of like rules, and it's kind of, it involves a lot of structure, right? There's a lot of intentionality in a fugue, right? It takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of compositional skill to write a good one. A prelude, on the other hand, there is no one way to write a prelude. Prelude is really just a title that means piece that comes before. But in practice, preludes very often had this character of sort of being improvised. Even if they weren't really improvised, they were written in such a way that you could imagine that the person playing it is just making it up as they go along. It's supposed to sound kind of spontaneous. There's one particular prelude that is actually part of a prelude and fugue by J.S. Bach, which you've probably heard before. I'm just going to play a little bit of it on my little electric keyboard here. This is the very first prelude. I'm just going to play some. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but the prelude number 1 from the Well-Tempered Clavier by J.S. Bach, which is a collection of preludes and fugues in every major and minor key. So the very first of these preludes, which is combined with a fugue, so it's prelude and fugue in C major, then prelude and fugue in C minor, prelude and fugue in C sharp major, prelude and fugue in C sharp minor, etc. Here is the very first prelude from the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1 by J.S. Bach. Tell me if you've heard this before. Okay, I'm just going to stop there. But you can tell, now this is very simple. It's the kind of thing that any decent musician in the Baroque era could kind of improvise. Now, maybe not, it might not be as exquisite as a piece by J.S. Bach, but it's the kind of thing they could improvise. It's really just a chord progression that is arpeggiated. I'm just playing the notes one at a time from bottom to top of a chord progression. It's very simple in its structure. It's the kind of thing that sounds spontaneous, improvised, that I could make up on the spot. And it presents, therefore, a good contrast to the fugue, which is a very complex kind of piece that sounds very learned, that obviously required some planning. Now, I should say, there were, and there are today, certain musical geniuses who could improvise a fugue, which the notion of being able to improvise a fugue, it kind of blows my mind. But there were people who could do it. J.S. Bach could do it. There was a famous incident involving J.S. Bach. J.S. Bach, when he was an old man, probably about my age, J.S. Bach's son, who was also a great composer, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, had gotten a job for Frederick the Great of Prussia, became court composer to Frederick the Great, right? It was just a big deal, all right? And so Frederick the Great invited old Bach, J.S. Bach, his court composer's father, who was not all that well known as a composer. He was like, old Bach, he's a good organist, isn't he? He was invited to the court of Frederick the Great, and shown around, I guess, his son's workplace. And Frederick the Great said to J.S. Bach, "So I hear you're a great composer of fugues." And J.S. Bach probably said, "Well." And so Frederick the Great said, "Could you sit down and improvise a 5-voice fugue for me?" And J.S. Bach said, "I'd rather not." He said he demurred. And now that's J.S. Bach could probably improvise fugues, but maybe, as an old man being put on the spot like that in public by the king of Prussia in front of a bunch of people, including his son, to improvise a five-voice fugue, I would certainly have declined myself as well. But there are people who could have done it back then, and there are a few people who can do it today. It takes a special kind of ability. Anyway, what more can we say about the fugue? I think I've pretty much covered it. What I'd like to do now is just take a few minutes, and we'll listen to the fugue, which is that's right. I forgot to mention the toccata and fugue. So I said sometimes we have a two-movement work, prelude and fugue, and sometimes we have toccata and fugue. A toccata, this is a very popular genre, pretty much for keyboard instruments in the Baroque era. It comes from the Italian word for touch, the verb toccare, which means to touch. So a toccata is a touch piece. What the heck is a touch piece? Well, in those days, the word touch, like your touch on an instrument, basically referred to your technique. So a toccata is a piece that is meant to show off your technique, your touch on the instrument. And the toccata could be just a standalone piece, but very often the composer would write a two-movement work, a toccata followed by a fugue in the same key. And perhaps one of the best-known works, this is something that you've probably heard. Let me see if I can find my organ sound on this here keyboard. I think maybe... There it is. Okay. So one of the best-known works of the Baroque, supposedly by J.S. Bach, people think it's by musicologists, experts, I believe, most experts believe that this piece is not by J.S. Bach, but it's always listed as being by J.S. Bach. You could Google it, and everyone, the lay people out there believe it is by J.S. Bach, but I think most scholars believe it is not by J.S. Bach. But if you've ever heard this thing... This thing, it goes on like this. All right, etc. This is a toccata. And notice it also has this kind of improvisatory character. The toccata was the kind of piece that organists would improvise all the time back in the Baroque era. They would improvise them, and sometimes they would actually write them down, right? But even if they wrote it down, it was always written in such a way that you could imagine someone just kind of making it up on the spot. It's supposed to sound spontaneous and improvisatory. So prelude and fugue, very, very common two-movement work in the Baroque era. Toccata and fugue, right? And Bach, now, whether or not that particular, and again, I'm just playing the first couple minutes of it, that's of just the toccata, and then there's a fugue that comes after. The subject of the fugue is like this. All right, and then it starts in another voice, etc., etc. Whether or not that particular toccata and fugue is by J.S. Bach, there are many other marvelous, wonderful toccatas and fugues by J.S. Bach for organ, for harpsichord, and I suggest you go on YouTube and Google them. Look for toccata and fugue, and you'll find many, many examples of wonderful. These are some of my favorite works by J.S. Bach are the toccatas and fugues. Okay, so let's look at the example of one particular fugue by J.S. Bach, which is included, it's embedded in your textbook, and I've got it on my in the listening. And this is a fugue often called the Little Fugue in G minor. It's Bach didn't call it the Little Fugue. It's just that, all that he called it is fugue in G minor, but he wrote many, many fugues in G minor. This particular one, there's a great fugue in G minor, which is longer and bigger. This one is relatively short. As you can see, it's only 4 minutes long, right? So this one was given the nickname Little Fugue. And it appears to have been written when Bach was only about 24 years old. And the subject, I'll just play the subject for you. I mean, you're going to hear it anyway once I once I start the recording on the computer, but it's... whatever it is. Sorry, I missed a note there. Should have played a B flat. All right, and then the subject comes in another voice as the first voice is continuing. All right, and these two go on for a while, and then a third voice comes in. I'm not sure if we have 4 voices in this fugue or not. We may. Let's listen to it, and I'll give sort of a little running commentary on it as we go, if my computer will cooperate. Okay, here we go. So notice the subject is appearing all by itself in the soprano voice in the highest register. And it's 5 measures long. And now the subject is appearing in a lower voice. The upper voice is continuing on with what the book calls a counter subject. Now here we still have 2 voices, but then a third voice comes in. This is the tenor voice. So far, it's all just fingers. We will hear the bass come in, and that's what will tell you it's a 4-voice fugue. Right here. Da, da, dum. This is with the feet. Da, da, dee, da, 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 dum. So now we have all 4 voices going on. And since we've heard the subject in all 4 voices, now we have an episode. Notice the subject is not being heard. We have other stuff. But here it comes back. La-dee-dum. Da-dee-da-da-da-da-dum. There's a pedal tone here. La. You hear it? A long sustained tone. Just move down. Here comes another entrance. Now notice how, just because this is a 4-voice fugue, we don't have to have all 4 voices going on all the time. Sometimes it's just 2, like right now. Here we have an episode. And there's only 2 voices going on. The other 2 are resting, and there are rests written into the music. Here comes the subject again. La-dee-dum, la-da-dee-da-da-da-da-dum. In the bass, in the feet, in the pedal board of the organ. And now another episode. We have all 4 voices going on, actually, in this episode. That's why it sounds kind of thick. Subject is going to come back right here. La-dee-dum, ya-da-dee-da-da-da-da-dum. And another episode. only 3 voices going on right now. The bass has kind of dropped out, but it's going to come back. It's going to come back with one more presentation of the subject toward the end. But this is still just an episode. We're not hearing the subject. We're anticipating its return. Here it comes. La-dee-dum, la-da-dee-da-da-da-da-dum. Also a pedal tone going on here. And that's it. Okay? So, as you heard, there were places where the subject was present in one voice or another, and places when it wasn't present, which we call episodes. Okay, I think that about wraps it up for fugue, and therefore also for instrumental music. We will now circle back to our vocal genres. And remember, in the Baroque era, when we're talking about vocal music, we are usually talking about voices and instruments together. This is a feature of opera, which we've already learned about, and also of oratorio and cantata. So those are the last remaining genres we need to look at, oratorio and cantata. We'll also look at a few more composers, about their lives and times, especially Bach and Handel, probably the 2 most important composers, certainly of the late Baroque, maybe of the entire Baroque. So that's what we'll take up then. See you next time.